like the other nations. When God set up an awesome government, a government that was to be admired. In fact, a government that all our governments today somewhat model. It's based off of the government of God. The taking care of its people. It says, but when the children of Israel wanted a king, something changed. Look what it says in the days of the kings. It says, which is going to answer why Hezekiah was clearing out and recalling back the people to give again. Why? Because it got corrupted, something happened. And it says right here in 1 Samuel, when the children of Israel first asked for a king, and in chapter 8, it says, and Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him of king. And he said, this will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you, O Israel, if you desire a king. He said, listen, he will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. He will appoint. Notice the king. Every word focuses and turns to the will of the king and no longer the will of God. So verse 12, and he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over fifties, and will set them to ear his ground. No longer is this the land in which ones viewed it. What Samuel was striving to tell them, that listen, if you desire a king, if you desire the rule and be governed by a man, it will now be his. It says to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. He goes on to say, and he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. In verse 14, and he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. In other words, to do whatever he wanted to do with it. Why? Because it will be his. In verse 15, look what he says, and he will take the tenth, the tithe, the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants and the goodliest young man and your donkeys, and put them to work. And he will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants, and ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which you shall have chosen. You and the Lord will not hear you in that day. And this is what happened in the days of the kings. The tithe no longer was the Lord's. It was now in the ownership and rule of the kings. And this is why we saw Hezekiah in the verse previous, when he was setting a course for the priests, and he was sending out a message for we're striving to turn back to God. Let's start giving the tithe in its right way again. Why? Because the king took it. So now when we talk about the government of God, it was no longer. It was now the government of man. When the days of the kings were established, when the children of Israel desired to be like the other nation, and God anointed a man in his stead, God gave that man everything that the children of Israel. So now the children of Israel was going to be under a man's thumb of rule and government. And so now in the days of the king, we see a different government established, to where the tithe was no longer given or used in the purpose that it was. In fact, the Levites became officers, became like politicians in the days of the kings. So throughout the kings, the tithe actually became something a little different. So to continue of what happened in the days of the kings, and especially with the tithe, in 1 Chronicles 23 verses 1 through 6, dealing with David. and to show you, but let's just read it. It says, so when David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel, and he gathered together all the princes of Israel with the priests and the Levites. Now the Levites were numbered from the age of 30 years and upward, and their number by their polls, men by men, was 30 and 80,000, of which 20 and 4,000 were set for the work of the house of the Lord, and 6,000 were officers and judges. Notice they were officers and judges. Moreover, 4,000 were porters, and 4,000 praised the Lord with the instruments with which I made, said David, to praise therewith. And David divided them into courses among the sons of Levi, namely Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. In 1 Chronicles 23, it goes on. If you just to jump to verse number 24, it says, these were the sons of Levi after the house of their fathers, even the chief of their fathers, as they were counted by the number of the names by their polls, that did the work for the service of the house of the Lord from the age of 20 years upward. But notice what David says in verse 25 and 26. He says, for David said, the Lord God of Israel hath given rest unto his people, that they may dwell in Jerusalem forever. So David said, listen, we're not going nowhere no more. This is our land, and we're going to stay here, and we're going to defend it, and we're going to fight. Remember when David went out, and Joshua and whenever the kings, Joshua started conquering, but David carried this thing out with a hard attack. And God gave David great favor and started conquering nations, to where David became king over all of Israel. Judah and Israel put together. So David says, look, we may dwell in Jerusalem for forever. And so in 26, and also unto the Levites, they shall no more carry the tabernacle, nor any vessel of it for the service of the Lord. Things have changed in the days of the kings. He said, look, no more. You won't carry this. And it was all right. Why? Because God, we can't say if it was all right or not in the eyes of God or not. But what I'm saying was that it was all right in that the king did whatever he desired to do. When they had a wicked king like Ahab, or some of those wicked kings throughout the history of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, they did whatever they wanted to do. And it somewhat seemed right to them. So, verse 27. For by the last words of David, the Levites were numbered from 20 years old and above, because their office was to wait on the sons of Aaron for the service of the house of the Lord, in the courts and in the chambers, and in the purifying of the holy things, and the work the service of the house of God. And we know that David wanted to build a structure, which Solomon came through and did by God's guidance. All right. So when it relates to the camp, we know how they somewhat camped around the structure, or the holies of holies, and how each family was closest to the tabernacle, and the children of Israel surrounded them from there. All right, so talking about the appointing, we read in Hezekiah, which put us on this small rabbit trail of what happened in the days of the king, and how Hezekiah, in the verse that lent us before we went into the scriptures of Samuel, it says that Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 31 and 2, he appointed the courses of the priests and the Levites after their courses, which is interesting. Why? If you read, and that kind of stems from, if you want to understand the courses of the priests and the Levites and how they were set up, you would go to Chronicles 24 and just First Chronicles and read 24, the whole chapter really, and it will somewhat give you the courses. But this is why we see in Luke chapter 1 at verses 5 through 10 concerning the father of John the Baptist, Zacharias, why he went in, and at that time the angel appeared to him. It was because it was his course. He was of a certain course that was set up and instituted by Hezekiah. So there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judah, a certain priest named Zacharias. Look what it says, of the course of Abiah. So this course system, which was set up by Hezekiah, it remained It stood the test of time. I mean, and David, I mean, these things, it remained to where we're seeing it in the New Testament day, to where the priests now, they operated differently than when God set them up, and in the government of God, the establishment of the king, it still was present to where they operated in courses. So that was the time for Zacharias to go in and do his priestly duties in the course of Abiah. All right, so what happened to the tithe during the rule of the king? After us kind of going over it, ponder. What happened to the tithe during the rule of the king? You'll find that as soon as Israel became a nation ruled by a king, the first tithe became part of a national taxation, and it was collected and redistributed by the king according to his needs. So pretty much the tithe became a tax, like a national taxation, for the king to do whatever he wanted to do with it. And we're talking about the tithe of pretty much the people were still given food, but the Levites became like officers, and whatever the king appointed them as, that's what they did. Why? Because the king had the rule, and this is the difference of when God ruled and the king stepped in. All right, now that the government of God was replaced with the government of man, was the tithe still viewed as being most holy unto the Lord? Question, something for you to think about. Was the tithe still viewed as most holy to the Lord, even if the king did what he wanted to do with it? And I would say yes and no. Why? Yes, because those who gave it probably were given it as most holy, and no, in that the king had the strength and power to utilize it any way that he willed to utilize it. When God was ruling the children of Israel, the whole purpose for the tithe when it was instituted was for an inheritance for the Levites. And so for them obeying God and God speaking it, it was most holy. And so I would say yes and no, and people could be split about it, but it's just something to think about as we walk through the teaching of the tithe. All right, so getting back on track. We dealt with 2 Chronicles 31, where Hezekiah appointed the course of the priest, and we see why he appointed the course, and now we can understand why in verse 5 and 6 this chapter 31, that the people were so eager to try to get back on track and to try to do those things that was right. It was almost like they missed the leadership of a godly man, more of God, but the leadership of a godly man, because of all the wicked kings that they went through, both Israel and Judah. All right, so still dealing with the question, what was the tithe? And I know you may be tired, but I thank y'all for hanging in there. And we're just going through, like, open up the Strongs and find the word tithe, and just read what that verse has to say about the tithe. And you'll find that it always somewhat relates to food. And so in Nehemiah 10 and 37, and that we should bring the first fruits of our dough, of our offering, and the fruit of all manner of trees and of wine and of oil unto the priests, to the chambers of the house of our God, and the tithes of our ground unto the Levites, that the same Levites might have the tithes in all the cities or tillage. It's almost like you could I don't want to say this because y'all will take me where you want to take me. I was going to say you could somewhat replace, no, you can't replace the word tithe with food, but as long as you understand that when you can see here, it's clear that when they gave a tenth, that they were talking about the inheritance and the provisions for the Levites to sustain and have life to live over. We see the same thing in verse 5 of chapter 13 of Nehemiah. And he had prepared for him a great chamber, where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of corn, the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and the offering of the priests. Once again, it was food. So, still dealing with the thought of what was the tithe, but now jumping into one of those critical, I wouldn't even call it critical, misunderstood portions of scriptures, which is the book of Malachi. And when you look at the book of Malachi, and we're here because the word tithe is mentioned here in this book. But we're not just going to jump to chapter 3. We're not just going to jump there. We need to comprehend what the book of Malachi is really talking about. So in Malachi chapter 2, verse 1 through 9, it's important to comprehend what Malachi is saying. Even if you read chapter 1, when he said, if I be a father, then where is my honor? But he goes on here. We're going to start off in chapter 2, verse 1. He says, and now, O ye priests, this commandment is for you. So somewhere along the line, the priests begin to get out of whack. And so Malachi, by God's Spirit, is sending this message out to the priests, to the Levites, those in whom we know came from Levi, the history that we just went through. But he said to the priests, this commandment is for you. So when we read this, put your mindset on your blinders and say, okay, priest, if you will not hear, and if you will not lay it to heart to give glory unto my name, said the Lord of hosts, I will even send a curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Notice what he says. If you will not do this, I will send a curse among you, and I will curse your blessings. Who is he talking to? He's talking to the priests that somehow lost track and lost vision and sight of their course, their order, and their purpose and their destiny for God. He says, I have cursed them already because you do not lay it to heart. Verse 3, behold, I will corrupt your seed and spread dung upon your faces, even the dung of your solemn feast, and one shall take you away with it. And ye shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you, that my covenant might be with Levi. He's striving to bring them back to a conscious state of behavior when it relates to adhering to the law and being a representation for him and serving him with a pure heart. He says, said the Lord of hosts, verse 5, my covenant was with him of life and peace, and I gave them to him for the fear wherewith he feared me. Now we see a reasoning why God gave his covenant. He said because Levi internally feared him, and this could be why the Levites had this righteous indignation. It says, and was afraid before my name. Verse 6, the law of truth was in his mouth, and iniquity was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and did turn many away from iniquity. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. Now speaking, obviously you can see Christ in there. But ye are departed out of the way. Notice, it's somehow the Levites begin to err. The leaders, the servants of God begin to err. This is why you see nothing, Malachi being the last book of the Old Testament. Why? Because the leaders err. And when the leaders err, the next one you see show up is John the Baptist and Jesus to reestablish a priesthood, or those that would work our service for God. And this is why Peter says that we are peculiar people. Meaning Christians, a holy nation, a nation of priests by the blood and lineage of Christ Jesus of God. So he says, you have corrupted the covenant of Levi, said the Lord of hosts. Now, let's move over to Malachi chapter 3. And you can read on in your spare time, but we haven't missed too much. But in Malachi chapter 3, before we get to those verses where you have robbed God and those things, let's read verses 1 through 6 so we could keep comprehending. It says, behold, I will send my messenger. In other words, what we just got finished reading, because they have lost their way. He said, as a result, I will send my messenger. He shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, said the Lord of hosts. But who may abide the day of his coming? And who shall stand when he appeared? For he is like a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap. He shall set as a refiner and a purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi. He shall get it right. He shall bring it back to their conscious state. And purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. So somehow they stopped giving the best. Somehow they stopped living in righteousness. And somehow they became corrupt. He said, verse 4, then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord as in the days of old, and as in the former years. And I will come near to you to judgment, and I will be swift, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against the false swearers, against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow, the fatherless, that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear not me, said the Lord of hosts. Notice how he talks about those in whom he set it up for them to establish, to take care of. He says, for I am the Lord, and I change not. Therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. Then it goes on in verse 7. It says, even from the days of your father ye are gone away from my ordinances. So that is key. Why? Because I don't want to give it away because I'm going to ask this question. But notice how he says you have gone away from my ordinances and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, said the Lord of hosts. But ye said, wherein shall we return? Where is the place of your name? Where shall we return? He says, will a man rob God? Question. Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and in offering. Notice in chapter 2, who is he speaking to? The Levites. When the people gave their tenth, they gave it to the Levites. And the Levites was to offer the best to Aaron the priest. And 1/10, another tenth of the tenth. So 1/10 to Aaron and the priest. And God told them to give the best. And so being that they wasn't given the best, God said, you robbed me. Why? Because you was not adhering to what I told you to do. And therefore they were offering to priests and also to God the spotted, if you would like to say. So you robbed me in the tithes and the offering. But notice this is dealing with the priests, the leaders. It's nothing with the people. And to show you that this is the case, that for them to be able to rob God, the people had to have given the tenth for the Levites to have something to keep for themselves, so that God can make this declaration of him being robbed. So it wasn't that the people didn't rob. It would have been different if the people never gave a tenth of all they had to the priest. So he says in tithes and in offering. So therefore, as we read in the verses prior, he says, ye are cursed with a curse. He spoke this prior. We just got finished reading it. For you have robbed me, even this whole nation. The people was doing the thing that was right. They were giving. So he was telling the priest, you have bring a charge against this whole nation. Why? Because they wasn't offering the right thing unto God, and so God was not pleased. And if he was not pleased with what was offered, he was not pleased with the whole nation. Let's keep going. Verse number 10. He said, bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse.